Robert Kennedy once said, and I quote, "Progress, it's a nice word, but change is its motivator, and change has its enemies," end quote. I would learn this only too well when I changed the narrative about Rudolph Valentino's only brother, Alberto. I changed the narrative based on documents I discovered, based on publicly archived records, and based on the first-hand accounts of those who witnessed the events. And I did not change the narrative lightly. I knew it was a serious change, and I acted accordingly. But because I made these changes in the history, I made enemies. Enemies who, even a few days ago, some 95 years after Valentino's death, called my changes fake, fiction, and trash, and with the tacit and quick support of the Alberto Valentino family. Why is there such an aggressively enforced refusal to accept as fact court records, the results of court-ordered audits, the sworn testimony of all concerned who were witness to the events? What is being hidden? And why do these people go to such lengths to, in essence, attempt to kill the messenger? Today I restate the documentation I brought forth, which changed the story of Alberto Guglielmi Valentino. I restate the facts. I challenge those enemies of this truth and respond to their most recent slander of me and my work by defending my documentation. In this episode, we title The Brothers Valentino.
Ciao, and welcome to another episode of our Rudolph Valentino podcast. I am Renato Floris, the proud publisher of all the scholarly and entertaining books on Rudolph Valentino and Natasha Rambova by Evelyn Zumaya, with some of the books translated by yours truly. I'm here today with Evelyn to discuss more about her fascinating work. Ciao, Evelyn.
Ciao, Renato. It's nice to be here with you to share this fine bottle of Valpolicella Classico.
Yes, a very good wine from Veneto.
It is. So today, some of the research discoveries about Valentino's brother, Alberto. As anyone who's read Affairs Valentino knows, Alberto Valentino contributed a complex and heavy element to the story, to say the least. I will not be restating the entire saga as I wrote it in detail in the book, but today focus instead on the false narrative still perpetuated about Alberto and reveal what I discovered to be the documented truth. In initiating this discussion, I want to make one thing perfectly clear. Contrary to what I'm being accused of doing, when it comes to the subject of one Alberto Valentino, I am not and never have been attacking anyone, but righting an historical wrong which I discovered. And it was not such a trivial wrong at all in light of how other people's lives and livelihoods were affected. And this is still the case. Not such a small issue at all as far as I'm concerned. Now, Renato, the legacy of Alberto Valentino's terrible lies ruined the life and legacy of George Ullman, trashed the memory of Natasha Rambova, and those lies are now being used to try and destroy our work. No small thing when facts are skewed with the intention to screw real people over, and badly. Now, in presenting this episode today, I want to also state that both you, Renato, and I work with no prejudice and never have. I think this is obviously evident in our books, and that readers can clearly see we are people of integrity, and we're very proud of that. It might seem corny to even say that, but it's the truth. We assess evidence as it is presented, or as it's not presented, and search for documentation as answers. We approach our work clinically, as you say, Renato, like surgeons, calculating with no emotional relationship attaching to the subject. This is our dictate. Trying to be as intelligent as possible and as objective as possible. In this we are not controlled by propaganda and are free to change our minds, and have. But when we have, it has always been based on credible evidence and not hearsay and innuendo. If that's corny for me to believe, then so be it. But today, the enemies of the truth about Alberto want us to believe that I lie, cheat, and fake it. Fake it all, first of all, and they want you to believe Alberto was an honest saint, as pure as the driven snow, and his every word the absolute truth. And this while they polish his halo with praise and glowing admiration for his perfection. The change in the narrative which I brought forth in his regard, well, I will just say the facts brought a great deal of this into question. And I felt it was a correction in the Valentino history that had to be made, without the slightest doubt. I did not choose to do this out of any other reason than it was a true story, and it made the existing story false. Nice word for lie. I had no idea it would ignite what it did from these people, nor that they could be continuing to be so fired up about it after a decade. It's incredible. Now, you know, Renato, someone once asked me if I thought Alberto cried at Rudolph's funeral. And I said I thought he no doubt did. It's kind of a curious question. Nothing I brought forth would imply they were not blood brothers Valentino, with all that this entails. But this said, siblings can still love each other despite not always being the best of friends. But the implication that my bringing forth the true story of brother Alberto Valentino, how it would somehow negate all feeling between the two brothers, is false. The Brothers Valentino story I uncovered is a turbulent one, where the truth is stranger than that shiny fiction.
I know the record you found recorded events from the first 6 months of 1926, and this was the documentation which revealed what really was going on.
You're exactly correct, Renato. The real story of Alberto came tumbling out of those court records I recovered, and they did cover a vast amount of Valentino's life and business the last 6 months of his life. We've spoken about my discovery and recovery of that cache of records in previous podcasts, but suffice to say it came about after I learned the original case file of Valentino's probate records was stolen from its rightful housing in the Los Angeles County Hall of Records. As far as I can place the timing of that theft, it would have been before 1965 because Valentino biographer Irving Shulman published his bio in 1965 and he was unable to find them. While I was interviewing the children of Valentino's manager George Ullman in 2003, they encouraged me to find the records before I wrote a word about the facts about their father's tenure as Valentino's executor and the settlement of Valentino's estate. It was then I discovered the original case file was stolen. Fast forward 1 year after many frustrating dead-end searches, I did locate about 1,000 pages of those records filed in the California Appeals Court Library. Now, these were copied and filed when Valentino's trusted business manager and close friend George Ullman filed an appeal to a lower court ruling. And, by the way, we will never forget to mention he was exonerated on all charges on that appeal. Now, when I read through those court records, so much changed in Valentino's story, I was blown away. What a challenge for me. But most of all, I was blown away because the story in regards to Alberto was nothing like the one being told. I'd read so many of Alberto's interviews and statements given throughout his lifetime, where he reports as fact how he received nothing but, quote, pennies from his brother's estate. Just a few sentimental items. I will say without hesitation that what I read in those records turned that version of Alberto's story upside down. It was 100% false.
How did this story go in such fictionalized direction? What happened?
Oh, Renato, there's no doubt it began when Alberto arrived in Hollywood after his brother Rudolph's death in 1926. Of course, the movie moguls were hoping he could take his brother's place as a box office bonanza. It was then Alberto realized he held the attention of the motion picture industry, and it was then he began to create his own version of many aspects of this story. And it was then he made his attempt to replace his brother Rudolph in the movies. and do his best for a while to exploit the Valentino presence in the good old US of A. He had several nose jobs to try and surgically look more like Rudolph. Tragically, this was an infamous and sad failure. But despite his later claiming he had no intention to try and replace Rudolph as a heartthrob, Alberto's efforts are publicly documented. I think this is obvious, for example, in the side-by-side images we've used for this episode's visual. Is that one of Rudolph's bow ties Alberto's wearing? I wonder who told him this was a winning idea, or was it his idea? Alberto did land a couple of roles in a few movies and even tried to promote his wife Ada, saying she had a stage career back in Italy. And oh brother, how he pushed Jean by repeating how much he resembled Rudolph. As Alberto struggled to become Rudolph on screen, the fake history of Rudolph, as generated as marketing of Rudolph, would be not only impacted but directly influenced by Alberto's new presence in Hollywood. He granted many an interview and held forth for press in his lavish Ambassador Hotel bungalow. Now, if he was not so able to charm on screen, he would surely do his best to exploit his new fame as Rudy Valentino's brother. The warm and fuzzy tale told over the years by Alberto and nurtured in the studio-generated versions of events portray Alberto and Rudolph as close brothers, buddies, and elaborates on their close bond and brotherly love relationship. Whether this was the case at other times in their lives, according to those who were present and on the scene as first-hand eyewitnesses, this was far, far from the reality by 1926.
Didn't Alberto visit his brother in Los Angeles then, in the month before Rudolph's death?
Yes, he did. Alberto visited Valentino's home, Falcon Lair, during the spring of 1926 with his wife and young Jean. And eyewitness accounts were recorded about that visit and the brothers Valentino's relationship then, which proved the fairy tale version false. George Ullman writes in his memoir how initially Rudolph thought it was a good idea to bring his brother and family to Los Angeles, but this was something he soon regretted. Ullman reports how Alberto caused conflict in the household with the staff with such acts as his having padlocks installed on the refrigerators to prevent the staff from eating his food. Ullman also writes how some staff threatened to quit, and how the fighting between Rudolph and Alberto ruined the last weeks Rudolph spent in his home Falcon Lair. Now, after I shared this in Affairs Valentino and took many a hit for it, I would discover a second eyewitness account which would corroborate Ullman's account. This by Spanish journalist Baltasar Coué in his book, The True Rudolph Valentino, a book Coué was working on with Valentino at the time of Valentino's death. And again, thank you for all your hard work translating that fine book into English, Renato.
You're very welcome.
Now, yes, Coué relates on page 124, and I quote, Rudolph had at the time 8 members of his household staff. As a result of the increase in household members, arguments were instigated because of his staff's increased workload. The Guglielmi family presented more work for them and concern as they tried to perform the useful tasks they were supposed to complete. Rudolph's family proved unable to take charge of the government of the home, and this manifested in such a way that the household staff lost all respect for said relatives. Not only did they ignore the orders given to them by said relatives, but sometimes they did the opposite of what was requested. Alberto and Ada suffered these things in silence as not to aggravate Rudolph's situation. The sister-in-law became sick because of so much discomfort. One day at last, Alberto decided not to tolerate such grievous disrespect from his brother's staff. He complained to Rudolph, who, as the master of the house, summoned the servants and asked them to respect his brother. The servant, with unprecedented rudeness, answered that since he was not able to respect Alberto, he preferred to leave. End quote. So, Ullman and Coué's accounts reveal a stridently different dynamic between the brothers than what has been reported in such books as Emily Leiter's Dark Lover. But this said, these personal accounts were not the sole basis for the changes I made, not at all.
Those found court records told much more about what was going on then.
They did. Extracts of the Falconlair household ledgers, called the Grey Books, were included in those records, recording the accounting of all expenses of Rudolph Valentino's household, and there it was, the revelation that payments were being made to Alberto almost weekly throughout the 3-month visit from April 7th to July 6th. And in this, I cite the appeals court records under Exhibit Number 9, 1926, Grey Book Household Expenses, lines number 800 to 805. The total Alberto received in that time frame was $6,150, which by today's inflationary exchange rate, times 15, makes that the equivalent currently of $92,250. Now, just to put that into perspective, at the time, the average U.S. family annual income was about $2,000, and you could buy a family car for about $300. So this was an enormous amount of cash, and some might say it was theirs to spend as they wanted to, granted. But as far as understanding the story, I think it's important to remember that at that time, when Alberto was receiving this money from his brother, Valentino was so strapped for cash, he had Ullman negotiating a high-stakes consolidation loan in which nearly every asset he owned was posted as collateral. It is widely agreed upon, Renato, that Rudolph Valentino was a tremendous spender and was deep in debt at the time. Money was tight between April and July of 1926. With Valentino carrying a huge overhead, while Ullman was struggling to pay the bills, cover the payroll, and prevent more debt from being incurred. I have no doubt the steep weekly outlays of what amounted to a spending value of about $7,500 a week to Alberto caused some tensions between the brothers. How could it not? The problematic subject of money between Alberto and Rudolph was further reinforced for me when I interviewed Bill South, Valentino memorabilia collector and friend of Alberto and Jean Valentino. Now, he mentioned the letters, I add, which collector Tracy Terhune now claims to own. Those letters between Rudolph and Alberto, which South told me were then in the possession of the Alberto Valentino family. South said he doubted they would ever make them public, because he'd read them all and most of them were, and I quote, just angry letters about money, end quote. On page 68, in the S. George Ullman memoir, Ullman writes the following, and I quote, almost weekly, Rudy received letters from his brother Alberto in Italy, inevitably pleading for money, which Rudy reluctantly, occasionally asked me to send to him, end quote. So according to Ullman, it was Rudolph who decided to send his brother and family back to Italy, and he asked George to schedule the departure while he was in New York for the openings of the Son of the Sheik. Ullman writes about the tense situation between the brothers Valentino as they said goodbye in New York, and I quote again the S. George Ullman memoir, page 70, and I quote, "We went to the pier in New York Harbor to see Alberto and his family off. He came to me and said that Rudy had refused to give him any money and asked me to lend him some. I didn't have much money, so I asked my wife to give him $100, which she did. Of course, she never got it back. So there we were at the pier, Rudy waving to Alberto on the deck, and when the boat started to move, Rudy said, and I can never forget this, quote, 'There he goes. I hope I never see him again.' Sadly enough, he never did, because he didn't live very long after this," end quote. I think with Rudolph's death, a dreadful thing happened to any remnant of Valentino's truth by Alberto's immediate and ambitious drive to actually be his brother. Alberto returned to New York, with Ullman meeting him, and again I read Ullman's words about this from page 86, and I quote, "Alberto arrived on September 1st, and I again obtained permission from the harbor master to meet the Homeric in mid-harbor by getting there in a tugboat. When I got to the upper deck, Alberto rushed to meet me. He said, "I'm so very sorry. I will take his place." This jolted me, of course, for several reasons. Alberto had practically no resemblance at all to Rudy, and in fact was not physically nor in any other manner qualified to ever be considered for a screen appearance. I said this to him because I was so affronted by his egotism, but he either didn't understand me or didn't want to. For his next question to me there on the deck of the Homeric was, "How big is the estate?" Up to this time I hadn't thought of anything other than that Rudy should have a decent burial. So I turned away from Alberto, saying, "I haven't any idea." End quote.
Alberto said he was changing the family name to his brother's stage name, just to keep his brother's memory, as if Rudolph Valentino needed that help. I imagine a guy, let's say, whose name is Joseph Levitch, better known as Jerry Lewis. Imagine when he dies, his brother appears, who is a clerk in some lost little town, and decides to change his name from Alberto Levitch to Alberto Lewis to keep his famous brother Jerry's memory alive. A little pretentious, don't you believe?
When his bid to replace Rudolph failed, and he seemed to have spent all his money, Alberto tried to say he had no intention of copying his brother, yet made every effort to promote Jean into the movies, and again forcing the lie that he received nothing, garnering sympathy. It was revealed in extensive detail through accounting and testimony in those records that Alberto received as advances from Ullman a total of $37,411, which times 15 for today's value would be $561,165. The story of how this played out against Ullman, with Alberto playing a legal loophole, it defies believability, and it is the basis of the story of Affairs Valentino. But I think there was a worse fiction purported, a more harmful one than Alberto saying he never received a dime from his brother. He engaged in what I found to be an irrational vendetta targeting Ullman. Alberto began his sad fake story of how he only got pennies and how Ullman was guilty as charged his entire life. And here in 1977, he's writing to French Valentino biographer Jean de Recville, and I quote, Alberto writes her, saying, quote, "When in reality my brother left a legacy of over $1 million, but we only got a few personal items of sentimental value. In fact, everything was absorbed by the settlement of Rudy's debts, the cost of his funeral, the transfer of his remains from New York to Hollywood, his huge tax arrears, the estate administrator's fees, lawyers, the cost of several trials caused by the incompetence of Mr. Ullman, who administered the estate poorly, as the court recognized." End quote. The documented history is different, and Ullman did not mismanage the estate, and Alberto received nearly $1 million before 1930 alone, which is only that which I discovered, and Ullman was 100% exonerated by the court. Not guilty on all charges. Incredible, the legacy of that lie.
Why did Alberto hate Ullman so much?
After Valentino's death, Ullman, as Valentino's executor, was in control of the finances and business, and this generated a great deal of jealousy and animosity from Alberto. Alberto petitioned the court to appoint him as executor, and the court denied that request. I will not relate the entire account of Alberto's machinations regarding his arch-enemy Ullman during the prolonged settlement of the estate, but I will say this. After gaining access to the records of that litigation he brought against Ullman, Alberto was the one who prolonged the settlement by objecting some 40 times to Ullman's attempts to file his executor's final account. And Alberto initiated what was a fruitless and frivolous lawsuit, which took years to wend its way through the courts and appeals process, which would ultimately exonerate Ullman, and for Alberto he would squander the entire estate which was rightfully Jean's. The actual facts did not matter, and Alberto began his revisionist history narrative.
This is when he began to blame Ullman and say he never received any money at all from his brother's estate.
The accounting in those court records did not lie. The totals Alberto did receive were mind-boggling. The total of his pennies received from Rudolph's estate totaled some $43,561, calculated to today's spending value, that would be around $653,000. Bearing in mind this is all the documentation I had access to, and I'm sure there was more, which provided more income, which was not included in the audit records of Ullman's appeals case. For example, we can take into account how Alberto exploited his brother's fame as income when collector Tracy Terhune wrote how Alberto sold Rudy's platinum wristwatch to collector Bill Self for $10,000. And I quote, Tracy Terhune writes, Bill Self purchased the watch. It was not given to him. He paid $10,000 for the item, end quote. Now, so there was a fast $10,000. No problem, except I believe those artifacts belong in a museum. And no problem, except Terhune, in his most recent post, was still trying to portray Alberto as someone who never exploited Valentino for $1. I have to wonder how very many of the belongings of Rudolph were sold or used as currency to gain such things as case files of public records. The truth is, all of this money, sales of Rudy's belongings and cash advances, etc., Alberto never reported this anywhere. It was clandestine until I happened along, and it was all buried in those stolen court records. In many ways, Alberto's audacious fiction, which so misrepresented George Ullman's truly stellar performance in spinning straw, as in huge debt, into gold, as in money for the Alberto Valentino family, while that fiction has grown now to absurd proportions. Alberto trashed Ullman as the reason the estate went broke, making him the fall guy for his own colossal failures. When the exonerated Ullman, fact, he paid Valentino's debt in full and made money for Alberto and Jean. Nowadays, to silence anyone, such as myself, from coming forth with facts and figures and publicly available court documents changing the story, it is the modus operandi to cry liar, fake, which seems much easier for them than to accept the new information. So, who's doing the accusing and name-calling? I'm just going to say some collectors and Tracy Terhune. Incredibly, when I first brought this story forth, they accused me of forging the records and documents. Can you imagine that, Renato? I was somehow able to construct movie contracts and fake all of those court-ordered audits. What kind of genius would I have to be to do that? So the cry of forger went up loud as they could make it, with Tracy Terhune claiming on a bootleg blog he set up under the title of Affairs Valentino, which, by the way, is still there after 8 years. He said that Affairs Valentino and anything I had to say about it was, quote, trash fiction, saying the work will all eventually end up in the trash bin of Rudolph Valentino history. Now, while he sat by and nurtured calling me a liar and a forger, he would then incredibly state and publicly that he had personally seen those stolen records in the hands of 3 collectors. You may ask, where are they now? But sometime around 2003, Donna Hill of the Rudy Fan site told me that the Valentino family spokeswoman, Janine Villalobos, exchanged one of Valentino's shirts for the entire case file. And collector Bill Self confirmed this to me by email, and that was the last I heard. But I no longer have to wonder what they're hiding, because I know. I think it might be a normal thing to present a shinier version of a problematic family dynamic. However, this shiny version misrepresented the role of Ullman, misrepresented Alberto himself, and presented a false version of Valentino's history. I feel strongly that when you write about historical figures, which Rudolph Valentino certainly is, then historical accuracy must take precedence over some loyalty to fellow collectors and the wishes of a family trying to maintain their concocted stories about their family member despite the reality of their actions. I knew I would have enemies in changing this narrative. And the Alberto Valentino family would claim I am attacking Alberto, that my revelations are fake, and I guess in claiming this they hope people will look no further than their word on it. But there's much more to this story, believe me, the details of which I wove into Affairs Valentino, with citations, 40 pages of them. The book and nothing about our work is fake and fiction, and we do our best to leave a map for anyone to find the same sources we did. In closing today, I again quote Robert Kennedy. Every time we turn our heads the other way when we see the law flouted, when we tolerate what we know to be wrong, when we close our eyes and ears to the corrupt because we are too busy or too frightened, when we fail to speak up and speak out, we strike a blow against freedom and decency and justice." End quote.
And for today, I say, as the usual, Fiat Justitia, Ruat Caelum, and for the good guys, arrivederci.